Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on environmental politics in Southeast Asia, organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program. My name is Jia Hui, and thank you very much for joining us today. Before we begin, please note that this session is being recorded and the video will be shared after the webinar. Later in the session, the panel will be holding a Q&A with the audience, so do submit your questions to the panel via the Zoom Q&A function, and remember to state your name and affiliation. You can also indicate if you would like to direct your question to a particular panelist. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our program's activities, please do sign up for updates at the link, which I will be putting in the chat box. Now, allow me to introduce our moderator for the session. Ms. Sharon Seah is Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program and ASEAN Studies Center here at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will now invite Sharon to begin the webinar. Sharon, please.
Thank you, Jia Hui, and thank you everyone for joining us. A very good morning, a very warm welcome to this webinar that will examine the environmental politics landscape of Southeast Asia. Several countries, as you know, in this region are going into election season or expecting to hold their elections in the next 2 years. Starting with the Philippines, whose elections will be held next month on the 9th of May, and then the Johor state elections later this year, as well as the Malaysian elections, which must take place by September of 2023. And also, according to the Thai constitutions, elections must be held by May 2023. And then there are the Indonesian elections expected in 2024 and Singapore in 2025, sometime away. Our speakers who have been monitoring political elections in their countries will share recent trends they have observed and postulate as to the likely future directions that Southeast Asia will take in environmental politics. So in view of the global attention on the environment and the climate crisis, the questions we want to examine are whether there is interest in environmental politics in this part of the world. Is there an environmental movement, so to speak? If so, are there green parties? What makes a green political party green? What is the role of environmental NGOs and what influence do they have in environmental policy making? What are some voter concerns regarding the environment or the climate? So we will first take a look at the global and regional trends and future prospects, and then we turn to the examples of the Philippines and Malaysia. Let me first introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Schaper, who is Senior Visiting Fellow at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Michael has a long-standing interest in environmental issues. He completed a PhD in environmental practices amongst SMEs at Curtin University and authored the book Making Ecopreneurs, Developing Sustainable Entrepreneurship. And he introduced Australia's first business degree major in environmental business management. Michael has been spending time with us working on climate-related issues in ISEAS, specifically on the role of SMEs in climate action, carbon footprints of SMEs, green franchising, and he recently turned to look at the rise of green parties in Southeast Asia. He will be our first speaker for this morning, and I want to hand this time over to Michael. Over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. Much appreciated. And I'll put up my slides in a minute. It's an interesting one. When I first started working with the Institute, when I had a look around at the landscape in terms of not only climate, but also environmental issues in all its many dimensions, whether it be business, community, social, or political. Now, one of the things that was very apparent when you first look at the landscape in Southeast Asia is the absence of a conventional series of green political parties, as you find increasingly in almost all other parts of the world. And hence the genesis of this discussion. What is the landscape here in Southeast Asia and how does it differ and why does it? So today what I'd like to do is quickly give a bit of background on that by first of all looking at the issue, the landscape of where we sit in regards to global trends, what political parties are, but quick bit of background. I'm going to look a little bit more at formal structures of green organised political parties, those that seek to capture, sit in legislatures, sit in cabinets, form parts of governments. It's not the only part of a political dimension, but it's a useful precursor. So I'm going to have a quick look at the nature of green parties globally, then look down at some regional issues, and also what are the future prospects, given what we might surmise to be the current situation, what is it likely to be going forward as well. So let's have a quick guided tour in the next 10 to 15 minutes of green politics at both the global and regional level. Okay, what is a Green Party? Well, generally speaking, it is a party that has, as it would suggest, obviously a clear focus on ecological, environmental, sustainability and related issues. Typically, though, it's also a party that encompasses more than just that. It also has usually fairly strong-rooted notions about participation by the general community. It has a strong commitment to social justice issues, and it also has, as you can see up on the slide there, a non-violence element there. So 4 key pillars are often usually put forward as being the definition of what constitutes a Green Party, as opposed to perhaps any other party that might have a very strongly pro-environment stance. Traditionally seen as something outside of the mainstream, as I'll show you in a minute, over the last couple of years, or in fact over the last 30 to 40 years really, Green parties have become a major player in the political landscape of many, many different countries. Just before we get off this slide though, if you're trying to put them on the political spectrum, and that is always a bit of a tendency, how do I categorise a given political party? Is it left-wing? Is it right-wing? Is it centrist? Where does it sit? Green parties sit in a funny place because environmental issues are in and of themselves often agnostic to left and right politics. You can be as conservative and concerned about the environment as you might be a liberal or left-wing advocate of change as well. And indeed, in different parts of the world, Green parties have shown not only their own particular green colours, but have also governed with colours of many other stripes. So in both Austria and Germany, for example, 2 adjacent countries, they've gone into governing alliances with both left-wing parties and right-wing parties. Sometimes they stay out of that fray. So it's very hard to categorise them in the way one might traditionally categorise parties of labour and organised capital, of conservatism and of progressivism. So again, this is because perhaps environmental politics are a little bit outside of the traditional mold. Green politics came about, has been a player in some form or another for almost 50 years now in many different parts of the world. In the early 1970s, just as we were starting to see the emergence of the first discussions about environmental issues, as we saw a number of governments start to form things like environment agencies, we saw the first starts of organised protests and consciousness raising. People might remember Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, in the late 1960s, and a number of other books that raised public awareness about the environment. And in the early 1970s, a number of individuals, either by themselves or under very general headings, not calling themselves explicitly Greens at the time, started to run in campaigns in New Zealand, in Switzerland, as you can see there, in Germany, Australia, and that spread. It spread throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And today, if we were to look across the global body politic, we would find that there are Greens not only very commonly in local government and municipalities, frequently in state parliaments and legislatures, less so, but still at a very large number of national bodies, and also in things like the European Parliament as well. And the vote varies, but in some jurisdictions it can be as high as up to a quarter of the vote on an ongoing basis, through to about 5% in others. I'll show you a couple of, in a minute, a few of those examples of them, but as you can see up there, that's an advert there for an early German campaign as well. Today, there are more than 100 political parties that would label themselves as Greens and form part of what's called the Global Greens Alliance. And that represents almost more than 400 MPs sitting in different federal parliaments, national parliaments right around the world. Within Asia itself, you can see, and Serina and Ruth will go into this in a little bit more detail, a little bit more specific detail, but right across Asia, you can see that there are organised parties, although not necessarily sitting in legislatures, but they are organised in a number of different countries, ranging from Japan and Korea right through to lesser obvious polities like Bangladesh, Nepal, and so forth. And indeed, there is not only a global Greens body, as you can see from that visual down there, but there's also an Asia-Pacific specific Greens political forum as well. And today, what we find, if we look right around the world, we'll see that Greens actually sit in governing coalitions in a whole host of countries. Many of them are in developed economies. You can see there are substantial presence today right across the European Union and most of Western, Central and Eastern Europe. They have also occasionally taken roles such as Prime Minister in countries as diverse as Latvia on one hand in Europe, right through to Vanuatu in the Pacific, heads of states. And in fact, I've just finished working in the Australian Capital Territory, where the Greens Party there not only has been in that legislature for close to 30 years, but holds 25% of all the given seats there. So it doesn't matter whether we are talking about a rich, traditionally rich economy such as an OECD member nation like the Netherlands, France, Finland, whether we're talking about middle-income countries or even we're talking about developing or least developed economies, what you do find is that Greens are visible right around there. And all of those countries that I put there, everywhere from Finland to Rwanda to Colombia to Kenya and a whole host of others, have all had, for example, Greens as ministers, if not principal office bearers. The one curious exception has been the mother of all parliaments, the United Kingdom, House of Commons, and the US national political situation. There are Greens highly active in both of those countries at other levels of government, but in Westminster, out of the 650 MPs, there has only ever been one Green MP. It's a sitting MP for Brighton, but literally only ever one. And in the USA, the system is such that there have been no Greens elected to either chamber of Congress, whether it be the House of Representatives or the Senate. Ralph Nader famously ran several times as a presidential candidate, garnering a reasonable share of the vote, but they've never actually held office or even seats in the federal legislatures there as well. So that is a bit of a curious exception, and it goes a little bit against the odds. Closer to home in Asia, what we find is that this has been a fairly diverse mix. Some of you might be quite intrigued to find that post-communist Mongolia, which has turned into quite a vibrant democracy and open market economy, had Greens as part of its very first post-communist governing coalition of interests. Taiwan has had Greens in its national legislature, and they still serve in local government. And as you can see, a little bit closer to Southeast Asia, there have been some organised parties, such as the Thai Forest Conservation Party, which holds 2 seats, 2 admittedly out of 500. And in the Philippines, an organised Green Republican Party, but one a very miserly small proportion of votes indeed. I'll leave a little bit more discussion of the Philippines over to Ruth to go through in a little bit more detail. But by and large, when you look through other parts of Southeast Asia, we've yet to see an organised Greens party contest, and successfully get elected to national legislatures in most of the other parts of Southeast Asia, certainly not in Singapore or in Malaysia, certainly not in most other states that actually, out of Southeast Asian body politics, that actually have representative, genuinely contested elections as well. So it's a curious anomaly. Apart from Thailand, at first glance, with its 2 MPs, it doesn't appear to be hardly any Green MPs sitting in the region. And that's a really good question. Why? Why is that so? Especially whether we talk about North America, South America, Africa, Central Asia, East Asia, when we talk about Europe, when we talk about Pacific or Oceania, we see elected Greens politicians almost right around the spectrum, but not so here in Southeast Asia. Why? Well, potentially there's some reasons for it. One might be that traditional interests such as continuing to vote on the basis of class or ethnicity or other similar racial divisions, which have been a very tried and tested political model for a lot of existing political parties that had to organise and win votes. Perhaps those allegiances in this region are still greater than interests and concerns about the environment. Maybe it's a fear of what a Green Party represents because it is not an established part of the political process in the region, so people are not quite sure what it stands for. Is it an extreme left party? What is it? People don't quite know. And finally, we also need to admit that, a bit like the United States federal system, that existing parties typically have not only greater access to raising money, to getting more media, publicity, but also from time to time have shown that electoral systems are frequently arranged in such a way that it benefits existing parties and existing interests rather than any new ones. Once you break through, that becomes less of a barrier, but you've got to break through to get there in the first place as well. Is this a situation we're likely to be stuck in, or is there a way forward in terms of, are we likely to see any Greens parties emerge in the future? Well, a couple of years ago, London School of Economics published a fascinating paper in which a couple of economists did a fairly detailed statistical analysis of voter patterns, parliamentary representation, and a number of other characteristics to work out basically some statistically valid definitions about where a Green Party is likely to actually emerge. And what they found was that a number of characteristics, these 5 as you see here, tend to be positively related with the emergence of Greens. So, for example, federal systems, and we have federal systems we have them in Malaysia, we have them in the Philippines, we have them in Indonesia. But federal systems generally see more Greens elected because there are simply more places to play. There is not simply a choice of voting only in a national election. You can vote at municipal elections, provincial, state or regional elections, whatever they might be called. And thirdly, also at national level. In fact, if you're a European, you also get to vote at a 4th level, which of course is the European Parliament as well. So when there are more spaces and more elected seats to fill, smaller parties simply have statistically more chance of getting elected. Service-based rich economies where class interests are less definitive of voting intention and material concerns tend to pale against other post-industrial concerns such as, for example, political allegiance, tend to also see more Greens emerge. So simply put, if you have a good, secure job, you feel that most of your basic needs are met, you're not voting necessarily for a political party on what minimum wages might be or what the welfare state might be. You are far more inclined to think about issues like climate change and related matters. And for that matter, the amount of publicity that environmental issues have also tends to work, actually in some ways, in both directions for Green parties. If it is a concern amongst the broad community about environmental issues, and our recent ISEAS survey concerns and also our examination of SME concerns showed that, for example, countries like the Philippines have very high levels of concern. If those interests are not being looked or addressed by existing parties, that will drive sometimes voters to embrace Green parties. Conversely, even when environmental issues are embraced by existing political structures and systems, that sometimes in its own way can validate the emergence of Green candidates because it means that this is a legitimate issue and it makes voters more comfortable and acculturated to actually voting for such candidates. And finally, we also find that the electorates with large numbers of, as you see there, well-educated, reasonably secure income, i.e. middle class issues, and younger voters. There is definitely an age cohort effect here. Typically younger voters and to some extent much older voters, both of whom are concerned about what's the prospects for the next generation or for their generation, tend to vote more on quality of life issues, either for themselves in the case of young voters or for their children or grandchildren in the case of some older voters. Generally speaking, if a political party can get in and can stay elected for 3 to 4 electoral cycles, elections, then it can generally fasten into the system and become an established part of the political framework. One thing that's not put up here, but is also worth bearing in mind, is do different electoral systems also make it easier or harder for Greens to get voted in? It was traditionally thought that, for example, proportional representation because it allowed so many different parties, would allow Greens to get a higher degree of representation than would occur under a single member constituency basis. But in fact, in many parts of the world, single member constituencies, if they are won by Greens, they can hold on to them. For example, in both the Australian lower house and in the British lower house, the Greens party has one single MP, and it is someone who has, in both cases, whether it be Brighton or Melbourne, held on to that seat for 3 to 4 cycles, roughly 10 to 15 years now. So what does that mean going forward here? Well, if you look at it, big picture, a couple of last comments here. We already have, as I mentioned before, federal arrangements and systems or pseudo-federal systems operating in a number of parts of Southeast Asia with fibre and electoral systems, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. We see an increasing growth of skills, knowledge, wealth, education, literacy, not only literacy, but also knowledge and interest about the world, and also about, more specifically, about climate change issues. We see a growing services sector. We see many of the indicators that the LSE paper have posited as being perhaps precursors to the emergence of more environmental concern that ultimately may translate into greater political concern as well. And it's not just the the LSE paper. As I mentioned before, ISEAS has done its own surveys on these and shown that it's likely these issues are important to Southeast Asians and becoming more important over time. And so too is climate change. Southeast Asia is already one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the impact of climate change. And as that becomes progressively more self-evident, then one would suggest that the likelihood of being elected as Green parliamentarians is likely to grow as well. We've already seen firsthand, as you can see from these photos, some of the impacts of climate change. It's going to continue, it's going to grow stronger. So when you couple both the economic and the social development processes underway in Southeast Asia, along with the climatic effects, it would suggest that the Greens parties in many parliaments are likely to become much more visible. So a final comment just before we go though. Green politics isn't just about getting elected. Once you get elected, what are you there for? Some Green parties actively go out to become parts of the system. They go out to become ministers, to sit in governing coalitions, and in some cases even to hold offices such as Prime Minister, whereas other Green parties have resigned themselves to being simply parties of protest, peripheral players in the political system. Part of that is a definite decision made by each of the respective parties. What does a political party want to be? Does it want to be a party of protest, or does it want to be part of the ultimate answers about what government needs to do? And to get into government and to make decisions is messy. Anyone who's ever been involved in the political process knows that it's not a matter of full idealism. There are often thorny issues, there are often wicked problems for which there is no perfect solution there. How do you cooperate with parties, for example, on the right wing or on the left wing, whose other aspects of their policies you might not be supportive about? Nuclear energy. Is nuclear energy a good or a bad thing from an environmental perspective? It reduces emissions, but it leaves a residue that lasts for many, many thousands of years. Where does one stand on the thorny issues governments have to address, especially in these times, about where they might sit in terms of military aggression? How sophisticated is the party? As parties become more established, you often find that indeed you have the emergence of professional politicians versus a grassroots community-based membership who sees themselves much more as part of the general community rather than part of the political elite. So there are many steps forward, many steps that still need to be undertaken in Southeast Asia. If I would be asked to make a guess, I would say that I would expect to see a greater number of Green politicians being elected, but once having got to that step, then they're going to be confronted with a whole set of new challenges as well. So with that, Sharon, I'll pass back to you. The final comment, of course, is that electoral politics are not the only way to be involved in the body politic, and I'll leave it over to our other speakers to talk about that.
Thank you, Michael. That was a really good context that you've set for us. Our second speaker is Dr. Ruth Lusterio-Rico, who is professor and currently Associate Dean for Academic Affairs of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the University of the Philippines Diliman. Ruth teaches courses in political analysis, research methods, environmental politics, and the legislative process. She has published several journal articles and book chapters on the environment and politics, policymaking, indigenous people's rights, and migration. So I can't think of anyone better than Ruth to give us this overview of the Philippines as an example. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Sharon. A pleasant morning to all. And before I begin, I would just like to thank ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, Climate Change in Southeast Asia program for this opportunity. So my talk will focus on environmental politics in the Philippines, and perhaps it will provide context to some of the ideas that were discussed by Dr. Michael earlier. So I'd like to share a few slides to guide my presentation. So these are the topics that I would like to, the points that I'd like to cover this morning, and I hope that I'll have sufficient time to discuss each one of them. So I'm going to begin with some features of environmental politics in the Philippines. In the interest of time, I will just highlight two major points here, and then go through a discussion of the different environmental groups in the Philippines and how they influence environmental policy making over the years. And then I'd like to discuss some of the major issues in environmental politics in the country in short as basis for assessing the road ahead for so-called green groups in Philippine politics, especially in light of the upcoming elections. So some features of environmental politics in the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, I would just like to highlight a few points. First is that environmental issues in the country are linked with poverty, equity, and access to natural resources, as well as political rights. So we can say it's a bit different, no, from the experiences in other places in the world, although perhaps similar in the developing areas. Hence, we can say that those who, in fact, those who study and follow environmental politics, I think would agree with me. This is not my original sentence, but I quote this. I've quoted this over and over, and I think it summarizes what environmental politics really looks like in the Philippines. It is that environmental issue in the country is more than anything else an equity issue. So I will elaborate more on this later on. In the country, we can see, secondly, what I'd like to highlight is the emergence of an environmental movement. Over the years, there are many active environmental or green groups, or what are also referred to as environmental NGOs or ENGOs. But in spite of this, there is really no major green party in the Philippine legislature. So it can be said on the one hand, that there has been lack or no impact of green groups in electoral politics. So I move on to two other features of the environmental movement in the country. It grew during the period of authoritarianism. So that was during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And that was an important point in the development of the environmental movement in the Philippines. Subsequently, it grew after the opening up of political space after 1986. So during Marcos's authoritarian regime, the country's natural resources were exploited to achieve national development and serve the interests of the dictator and his cronies. So environmental NGOs and people's organizations, that is the groups in the local communities, they've emerged to protest against the exploitation of natural resources, in particular the pursuit of development via foreign-funded projects that cause the destruction of the country's environment. For example, there was massive deforestation during the period of the Marcos authoritarian rule. It's not just because of the timber that were sold in the international market, but also due to the construction of dams. And the pollution from coal-fired power plants are also, is also a highlight, no, in terms of the experience in this nature, in this aspect from that period. So ordinary people, in fact, were considered as the first environmentalists in the Philippines, as they became the catalyst for halting the plunder of the environment and being initiators of sustainable alternatives. So many scholars actually already wrote about this role of people at the grassroots level. So we can see the emergence again of environmental NGOs and people's organization. It had been observed during that period of authoritarianism. So the conditions under the authoritarian rule provided, in effect, the impetus for the growth of the environmental movement. And later on, as the democratic space opened up after 1986, this same movement flourished. And subsequently, that democratic space provided political opportunities for the different environmental groups. So what are these different groups? These environmental groups actually come from diverse political backgrounds. At the beginning, they were mostly legal organizations that dealt with environmental concerns. But later on, most of the environmental groups also took on a more developmental role as opposed to being simply concerned with conservation. They are also advocates of sustainable development, champions of environmental standards, especially those that have been adopted through international agreements and conventions. So during the period, what was also observed was that they built alliances. So the various groups, although they come from diverse political backgrounds, they built alliances. And many of them served, and these alliances served as watchdogs to monitor the implementation of environmental rules and regulations at the local level. So we will see some examples of environmental groups, of what these groups were or are. And this slide shows a list, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of the different groups, but I just really wanted to give an idea of what these groups are. So just to quickly go through this, at the end of the list, you will see that I've put there community-based groups because there are plenty. And then there were also, of course, initiatives by the local Catholic churches and other Christian churches. So these are what I referred to as the different groups of various or diverse political backgrounds. Okay. In the next slides, what I will show are some examples of how, of the advocacies of these groups. So this is from Greenpeace, Philippines. So in the advocacy for the law, the renewable energy law, it has become a law. Okay, another one, this is an alliance. Alianza Tigil Mina, in English, translates to Alliance to Stop Mining. So this photo is from that group. Okay, it is a coalition, as the slide shows here, a coalition of organizations and groups who have decided to collectively challenge the aggressive promotion of large-scale mining in the Philippines. And then finally, for the last example, this is from the Eco Waste Coalition, another example of coalition building from the different green groups, right? So we move to the influence of these environmental NGOs in environmental policy process. So there are many good environmental laws in the Philippines. The problem is that many of these laws are either not implemented or not properly implemented. environmental groups are in the different stage of the policy process. So in the discussion, I would like to highlight the different types of engagement. Again, this is not all because there are plenty. So environmental groups are in policy formulation, in policy implementation, and in policy evaluation and monitoring. However, the roles of environmental groups in the stages of the policy process depend on their linkages or connections that they have established with policy and decision makers and other stakeholders. In other words, their roles are really indirect. So the three laws that I have here on the slide indicate the different roles that the different environmental groups and the coalitions, the alliances have taken. So these laws are actually quite old, so meaning they have been passed a long time ago. So first is the Clean Air Act of 1999, and the advocacy of the green groups was very strong for the enactment of this particular law. The second one is the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act. Although the passage of this law was not really through a strong advocacy, but actually because there was a disaster that happened sometime in 1999 also that triggered the enactment of this law. So this was in fact approved very swiftly. However, the role of green groups in the policy process with respect to this law is in terms of its implementation at the local level, because it is really the local government units that are mandated to implement this particular law. So this is this law has been existing for more than 20 years actually. And finally, the Mining Act. Okay, it's a different role again. The environmental groups actually have served as a watchdog for the implementation of this law. Not really, well, of course, for the protection of the environment, but just to give a brief background, in 1997, when this law was enacted, it was really to liberalize the mining industry in the Philippines. So in pursuit of economic development during that period. The environmental groups were actually caught by surprise when this law was approved. Legal environmental groups raised questions on the constitutionality of this law. To make the long story short, such action resulted in the postponement of the implementation of the Mining Act for a few years until the Philippine Supreme Court reversed its earlier decision on the question of the constitutionality of this law. So in other words, right now, this law is again very actively being pursued. All right, so now I move to the major issues in environmental politics in the Philippines. So as I have already indicated, the Philippine government has been very strong in terms of the passage of laws. So the experience of the country, okay, can now be considered that we are strong in words but weak in action. Actually, it's the government. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are many good laws, there are existing laws, but the problem really is in terms of its implementation. A second issue is the lack of harmony or the conflict that and inconsistencies among the different laws. For example, there are, I will just cite one. As I mentioned earlier, there is the 1995 Mining Act, but there is also a law that is supposed to protect the rights of the indigenous peoples. So this was passed 2 years after the mining law was approved. So this is called the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Now, why is this law important, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act? It's important because the law grants the rights to the indigenous peoples to their ancestral domains, which happen to be mountains, all the places where they have traditionally settled in. And these are also the same areas where the mineral resources are. So that is the reason why there is this continuing problem with regard to the implementation of these two laws. Okay, a third issue is the democratization of decision making involving the control and use of natural resources. So really, this is a question between local versus national government. Earlier in the presentation of Dr. Michael Schaper, he mentions there that there is a federal type system in the Philippines. Well, it is only, to be more precise, a decentralized form, that in certain areas, the local government units have autonomy, but in the area with respect to the use of environmental or natural resources, it is still largely in the hands of the national government. In other words, centralized. So decision-making involving the control and use of natural resources, this has really been a long issue, long-term issue with respect to environmental politics in the Philippines. So for the green groups now, okay, I'm sorry. Therefore, going back to the third point, the challenge really here is balancing economic growth and environmental protection, both at the national and local level. The point being raised is mainly about the benefits that are gained if development and in expanding it further so that they can have an actual voice in policy making. So that pertains now to the development of a Green Party. Again, earlier there was mention of Green Party of the Philippines, but I'll postpone the comments on that later on. Okay, now the road ahead. For the upcoming 2022 elections, we see the active involvement and participation of environmental groups, both in the national and local elections. However, there is only one national candidate, a senatorial candidate, who is running under a green agenda, and his party is called the Green Party of the Philippines. However, this candidate is running under another party called Lakas ng Masa in Filipino, or Power of the Masses. And to be brief about it, in other words, I would say that public awareness of this particular party, of this Green Party, is really still very low. Okay? But of course, there is some prospect in that, in the sense that it is an improvement, that there is one who is now running under an environmental agenda, pursuing an environmental agenda. Okay, the positive, I think the positive point here is that I see the continued active participation of environmental groups in politics through their advocacy and campaigns, and serving as watchdogs in the implementation of environmental laws, regulations, and international commitments. The challenge ahead for them is getting public support to push the green agenda and move away from traditional politics. So I guess that I'd like to end my talk on this, and I look forward to the Q&A later on. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ruth. I think there are lots of good tons of food for thought for us to come back to later in the panel discussion. I'll now move on to our third speaker, who is Dr. Serenarahman, who is visiting fellow with the Malaysian Studies Program and the Regional Economic Studies Program here at ISEAS. And Serina has been examining issues of unsustainable development, including palm oil, rural politics, political ecology, and climate change impacts on the Malaysian rural communities. I know she'll hate me for saying this, but she was awarded the Iskandar Malaysia Social Hero Award in 2014 for environmental protection, and she's also the Malaysian Ambassador for Citizen Science Asia. She's currently the Adjunct Assistant Professor at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at NUS. So over to you, Serina.
Thanks, Sharon. It's still morning, so good morning, everyone. And thank you for tuning in to this seminar. Thanks for having me here. Let me share my screen and get straight into it so that we have enough time. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, Okay, so my bit for today will be a focus on Malaysia, of course, because that's all I know. And this is really what we're going to be talking about in my little session. So with a Malaysian Green Party, we actually do have one, but more like an online movement. Is there actually political interest in the environment is really what we need to consider. And what is the Malaysian context behind that? Much of it, when I listen to Dr. Ruth is really quite similar as the Philippines. And so I don't think we can get to the level that Michael was talking about earlier about, real political green movements. There are environmental movements, however, many in Malaysia. There's a good, strong environmental, there are many environmental groups that are moving and trying to solve issues such as coral bleaching and planting mangroves, among other things. And we do have good laws, but we need to look a little bit more into that. And then we look beyond the green and blue horizons because the planet is actually blue, and see where the way forward is. Right, so we'll get right into it. Here it is, the Green Party of Malaysia. Many people don't actually know about it. This was formed in 2010. Parti Hijau Malaysia was started by Azlan Adnan, and I stole these from the internet with no permission. And really what he wanted to do, according to a few articles, was to unite environmental NGOs and to launch a new political consciousness, is the quote from an article that interviewed him. But he was faced with a lot of difficulties. And in the end, this party did not stand in the elections, and they have remained merely an online movement trying to get people together. So the question then is, if they had decided to stand in the next elections at the time, would there have been support? Why not? What were the obstacles? In one of the articles that actually quoted him, there was a discussion on how difficult it is to put forward party representatives. We've seen it at the state level, at the national level, the cost of doing that, the number of members you must have. It really is very expensive. And to be honest, environmental movements, people involved in protecting the environment, people involved in green NGOs usually have huge issues with fundraising. So there are many levels of issues that we will then look into further in the next few slides. So is there political interest in the environment at all? So if you look at the recent elections, so Malaysia's 14th general election, we've had many changes of government since then, but the last election was actually in 2018, even though we've had like 3 different governments since then. So we go back to that one. There were some issues that were raised in relation to the environment. Linus was one. The DAP in Penang, for example, as part of their campaign, put forward a climate change plan. And this, of course, is political reaction to recent events. At the time, there were severe floods in Penang. The NGOs were going on about overdevelopment on hill slopes, and this actually happens all across Malaysia. In KL, there is the still ongoing issue of Taman Rimba Kiara, which is like a park in the middle of a quite wealthy suburb. And so the people there were protesting the development in a planned development within this park that sort of just appeared out of nowhere. Then there were issues surrounding the Kinrara-Damansara Expressway. KIDEX, it's a new highway that would have cut through a beautiful primary forest, known to be full of wildlife. And again, these were pushed through without much discussion with stakeholders, or, the questions were about transparency. Merdeka Center survey, I forgot to put in the year, but about this time, I think it was actually before 2010, said that 81% of the people surveyed were concerned about climate change. So there is an awareness, but we must also take into consideration that when people answer a survey, they want to say the right things. So we don't know if, how many people they surveyed and whether people actually knew anything about climate change or were just responding because it is a fashionable thing to say and do. When these issues were brought up, the issues listed above, in relation to the 14th general election, to be honest, a lot of the discussion was about the transparency or lack of it in the development or the approval of these projects, the question of corruption in getting the approval. Of course, at the back end of it was the concerns about the environment and what it will do to the habitats, what would be the consequences to wildlife and to people, or to water catchments. But really the issues were about transparency. And whether any of this was truly above board. So in the 14th general election, 2018, we actually had a change of government. We had the Pakatan Harapan coalition come into power. And as soon as they came in, we had announcements about climate change action. There were new declarations on, our targets. And then Yobiyin put in a whole raft of movements to eliminate plastic use and straws and plastic bags and all of that. Of course, at the same time, we were also promoting oil palm quite vigorously. So there is that question that some people do put forward: how environmentally friendly are we really? If oil palm is as bad as the campaigns puts it out to be. The question that I would like to raise is, what about the urban and rural differences when it comes to political interest? Now, this of course spins off from my work for the elections, studying the difference between urban and rural communities and the voting behavior. What we need to understand is that if you look at the list of issues that were raised during the 14th general election, these were really, apart from the mining issue, in the Linus mining issue or Linus, these are really quite urban issues and urban people that were protesting, whether it was Penang or in KL or the Kidex Expressway. Really, this was a movement. People that were protesting were from KL, the Klang Valley. So what I've seen, as with the voting, is that things like environmental consciousness, environmental action happens a lot more in developed urban areas where people are comfortable and are able to put food on the table and have shelter over their heads and have no other pressing worries, and are able to then think beyond themselves to larger issues like the environment. But when it comes to voting in Malaysia, all of these urban people, it takes many of them to vote for one person because of our delineation, our voting delineation. And so the boundaries of a voting center. So how it works in Malaysia is that for urban areas, it takes a lot of people to vote one person into power. And for rural areas, it takes a lot less people to vote one person into power. We also have vast rural areas, which can, for the past, well, for many general elections since we've had them, actually tilt the basis of power towards the rural voters, because it takes so much less of them to vote so many more politicians into power. What this then means is that all of those people who might be interested in environmental issues are concentrated in urban areas where they will have less representatives in terms of numbers, as opposed to perhaps rural areas which are less interested in the environment, as I've seen, who would then vote politicians who then see no need to be so interested in environmental issues. So I think this is something that we need to understand about Malaysia. Not to say that rural people do not care about the environment. Usually environmental issues directly affect their livelihoods, whether they're farmers or fishermen, whether it's the floods or any other issues. However, and I'll go into this a little bit further later, because of other pressing needs that they have, bigger issues like the environment, climate change, more macro issues such as this does not raise high on their list of interests and what they want the politicians to fix. I thought this was ironic. The Johor state elections happened earlier this year, and Pejuang, which is Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad's party, gave a talk about how they were standing for sustainable development in Johor and how they would ensure that everything that comes up in Johor would be sustainable. I thought this was ironic and interesting, because Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who is their head, is known as the father of development and is known for being behind the vast industrialization and conversion of natural areas into towns and cities and developed areas. So this is very interesting. And so we see just in this little picture how much politicians say and do in line with what they campaign. Let's just put it that way. Right, so coming back to the Malaysian context, I use this a lot actually in class. When I teach environmental politics, I'm using it here, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you look at rural communities, communities who are usually in the B40, the bottom 40 percentile, what do they need? First, they need their basic needs. And for many in Malaysia, this is sometimes not met. right? So it is only when you reach the higher levels of the Maslow's hierarchy can you then think about other things like saving the planet, saving the mangroves, you know, the corals are bleaching, let's do something about it. You know, we're running out of tigers, what do we do? Is it important? If you are in a rural area and a tiger is a threat to your livelihood, preserving its population might not be very high on your list. So that's just putting it into perspective, right? So perhaps in a rural area that carries more weight when it comes to voting, therefore the politicians who represent them don't need to care so much about the environment. These are not the issues that the people are concerned about, right? So they're more concerned about the economy and this kind of thing. Who holds the power? If you have more politicians representing rural people who are not interested as much about the environment, where issues of, is the highway going to cut through my forest, being the deciding factor to vote for or against you, you know, if many more people don't see the need to focus on this as a voting issue, the politicians are not going to look at this as something to work on, right? The other thing to consider is who makes the decisions in the country. So in Malaysia, as with many other Southeast Asian countries, decisions are really made top down by people in power, whether it's politicians, whether it's, you know, absolute powers like the royalty, whether it's businesses with a lot of clout and money, and who suffers as a consequence of decisions which may not take into account environmental issues or other social issues would be those people at the bottom of the pyramid that you see here. And then we have the issues of COVID, which has just hit us for the last 2.5 years. When the economy has been battered, when people are unwell, really they're not going to be able to think about the environment because they just want to survive, they want to be better, they want the economy to run. And the last thing they'll think about is, oh, if we jack up all the factories to be producing as they were pre-COVID, we're going to harm the environment and add to global warming. That's not going to be something they think about. Right? We have many environmental movements, organizations, groups across Malaysia. Malaysian Society was founded in 1940, that's 82 years ago. This is one of the oldest. And just, you know, as a point to note, because it's a Singapore institution, the Singapore branch, the Nature Society, Singapore broke off and stood up, you know, started its own in 1991. So there are myriad habitats, species, issues, or causes that these environmental NGOs represent. So it's not that there is not an interest in the environment at all. A lot of it is, however, concentrated in urban areas. There are NGOs that go out to rural areas and ask people to get involved. There are rural people who are interested in the environment as well, but the numbers are very few compared to those in urban areas. There are also organizations that try to consolidate NGOs like Mango, which is the Malaysian NGO sort of platform and umbrella. Doesn't really work. It's very hard to reach out. Why does this happen? So we need to think about what kinds of NGOs there are out there. So there's some which are government related. There are national NGOs like the Nature Society. There are international NGOs like WWF, which has a lot more money, a lot more clout. You know, the branding is really good. And then you have grassroots and community-led organizations, which are usually very focused on a specific issue, specific location, struggle with funding, but very grassroots. So there's many different levels. So when we're talking about a political movement, many of these people are really passionate. You know, they really want to do a lot, but because when they look at the political structure of the country, the huge obstacles as the Green Party faced, perhaps they think, maybe let's not get into politics, even though we think we might be able to fix it from within. Let's just do what we can on the outside. And so then you have the NGO movements and you have the politics, and it doesn't necessarily meet. Sometimes the NGO issues become political issues, either used by the politicians to raise their name or used by the environmental, you know, individuals or groups to make it an issue, as they did in Kiara. But this may not necessarily work in rural areas or in grassroots community areas. Sometimes it does. Bacalalan, for example, is a community that works very hard to preserve its forests up in the mountains. And so they support a representative that has been fighting for them in that aspect. So some communities are more aware than others. We need to also be aware that we cannot brush rural indigenous communities as a whole being completely for the environment, really in tune with nature, wanting to protect everything, because there are individuals within them who are more interested in money. There are individuals within them who really couldn't care less if they live within rubbish or, you know, if they use a lot of plastic. They're really more concerned about themselves, about whether they have money, you know, and they may not have all of these idealistic principles that many people seem to feel that indigenous rural communities have. You know, not everybody really is all that in touch with nature. There are people who don't care. So this kind of thinking actually occurs anywhere, regardless of where they are or their economic background. So there are those who care and those who don't. What I'm trying to say is just don't, you know, brush everybody with this stereotype. There are also different ways that environmental NGOs function. Some feel that using politics is the key to success. Others don't want to mess with it. Others are involved in environmental NGOs, to be honest, just, you know, because they want their name to get bigger. We've had issues before with environmental NGOs where we know certain people get involved with them and then they go on to be politicians, so it makes them look good. Others just really want to help the community. So when you have all of these different intentions, goals, abilities, reach, you know, power behind them, then it's very hard to bring people together. And this is what Mango faced, and this is what the Parti Hijau faced, the Green Party faced. It was very difficult to bring people together. And this is on top of other issues such as institutional structures that prevent, you know, new political parties from moving up, or fundraising, etc. This sums it up because I've been talking a lot. First picture with the fishing. So you see poor people, somebody's trying to fish. I work with coastal fishermen. I have an NGO that helps coastal fishers. It's a community empowerment movement, and I'm just the advisor. But I get slammed by KL environmentalists who tell me, why are you helping fishermen? They are destroying our seas. We shouldn't even come to visit you. So there's a big difference in views between some environmentalists who think that, you know, people like fishermen should just not be helped at all. And there are other groups that think, you know, artisanal fishermen, traditional fishermen are the way to go for sustainable fisheries, and we should help them. So this is another issue that comes up. When you have a community, an environmental group that thinks fishermen are destroying the seas, and, you know, we need to save the fish which are down there. And of course, the father fish is trying to get bait for his baby fish. Doesn't work that way, but never mind. You know, so this is the difference in views. And this also prevents a whole-scale environmental political movement. And then you have this other issue in the image on the right. And this is what I get a lot when I speak to rural people about environmental issues. So I tell them, please don't throw plastic into the sea. You know, we should do this with sustainable fisheries. We should be more concerned about what we do. And they turn around and they tell me, yeah, you're talking to me. I need to fish to buy baby milk powder and diapers for my children. Why aren't you talking to the big developers that are reclaiming our seas? Why aren't you talking to the oil companies that are polluting our waters? And so I lose anything that I can say to them about it, because what they're doing, what some rural communities are doing, is really just trying to survive. And I put there again the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just to remind you that, you know, if you are in a situation where you are struggling for the last two tiers, the bottom two tiers of the pyramid, you're not going to think that whatever little you do will have a benefit to the larger picture. Can they work together? As I mentioned, there are different strokes for different folks. Calvin and Hobbes illustrates this in that, you know, some people think to save the environment is to put fish in an aquarium and teach people about it. Others are vehemently against aquariums, for example. So when you have lots of different people with different intentions, goals, abilities, personalities, or, you know, whether they're standing for this issue for their own self-glorification or really genuinely for the cause, it's very hard to bring people together into a single environmental political movement. And then you have territory. So there's politics amongst NGOs as well, because we are many environmental groups trying to fight for the same space, whether it's geographical or whether it's, you know, to prove your credibility above other NGOs, because there are limited funds to fight for, because there are a lot of personalities and egos who are doing this, you know, so there are a lot of issues. And to bring people together into, you know, political movement just adds a whole other layer of issues to it. There was a survey done in WWF in 2009. One of the people leading it was Prof. Esther Daniel, who I know very well from University of Malaya. And at the time, there was, of their respondents, there was 50% awareness of species identification, environmental awareness, time spent on action for the environment based on surveys done with people. And these were quite long-ranging surveys. They were not just like ticking a poll. They are redoing this survey now, and they do feel that there is an increase, especially as you see the Merdeka Center survey, 81% awareness of climate change, and they're looking at whether there is actually more environmental citizenship amongst people. What we do need to see, however, is whether this environmental awareness, action, and citizenship is concentrated in urban areas, or whether people beyond, where they actually have more impact on voting for politicians that will make a difference in terms of environmental issues, whether there is the same sort of interest and awareness at all. I think politicians need to be surveyed as well, but I really do feel that for the majority of politicians, the environment is really not what they're going to bother about. Because when you support environmental causes, you get in the way of projects, you get in the way of development and projects and building up infrastructure, ensuring that all coastlines have resorts and all of this. This is a source of income for state, for political groups, for everybody else. And so putting your foot down to stop this actually cuts off your funding access. So it's going to be very difficult for many politicians to do this. A lot of the NGOs are actually working from the lower levels of the larger power structure within a country. Therefore, they have limited influence. Of course, large organizations like WWF, there are many NGOs that actually have an influence on policy making. But whether those policies actually have a difference in real life action is another question. So as Dr. Ruth said, as in the Philippines, we have very good environmental laws in Malaysia. And once we get past the clickbait campaigns that politicians will do, and I've already talked about this first point, do the laws that we have, can they be implemented? Of course, there's corruption, there's lax implementation, there's not enough manpower is always the reason we're given. But we also have issues of overlaps in jurisdiction. So similar to the Philippines, we have different organizations, different agencies in charge of certain things. And this then gets in the way because one agency will say, this is our territory, you can't get involved in that. You have state versus federal laws, and then you have overlapping laws between state and federal areas. So as with many discussions on flooding, forests, for example, the federal entity can put out all kinds of laws on the environment, but the state entity oversees land, agriculture, water, and this kind of resources. So who then decides? Is it for the greater good, or is it for the state good if they are able to make money from the exploitation of resources? The poor, who are usually the ones who are affected the most, natural areas, flora and fauna have no voice. They have very limited, for the poor perhaps, voting interest, and for the rest, they have no voting power at all. Who goes to jail for environmental crimes? I think we can count on our hands how many, and usually it is often the ones at the bottom and not really the big gun behind the whole thing that goes to jail. So where is the enforcement is the question. And then sustainable development, we have all kinds of branding, SDGs, with all kinds of claims by many companies and agencies as well. It is greenwashing. A lot of it is greenwashing and branding. How much is actually being done on the ground is the question. Sustainability is not necessarily inclusive, which means it does not necessarily take into account the people who depend on environments being healthy for their livelihoods. And this is my last slide, where we look beyond. So on the one point, there are the people or the groups who find out so much that they can't do anything more. I've met many people who come to me and they say, oh, I'm just so depressed, we have all these issues and we can't do anything about it. Or there's just so much happening and we make no difference because we're so small. And then they just give up, right? So it's very hard to say. You have too much information and then you sort of hit a wall and you can't do anything. Will it get to a point where once COVID is done and the economy is stable, because we do have increasingly frequent natural disasters, we've seen the floods of 2021 in Malaysia, nature-based livelihoods in rural areas become affected. We have food insecurity. Will this then drive people to be more aware and then vote where the environmental issues are. Is it only then that people will take notice? But can they make a difference? Who holds the power to decide we need to stop the environmental issues? Who holds the voting clout when our voting area, the delineation is such? So many layers of issues, so many layers of complications that can get in the way of a proper green environmental movement, political movement that might have a difference to Malaysia's future. So the little bit on the left is my environmental fit. At the minute, of course, Malaysia is as it is where it says it's wrong. Let's see whether we can move to where it is on the right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serina. Thank you. Just you know, showing us the complexities and the gray areas in the sustainability debate and also the current present situation in Malaysia. I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Please state your name and your affiliation when you pose a question. And as we wait for the questions to come in, maybe I can start with a question of my own. So we've been talking about, you know, whether political parties, whether we should work from the inside out or from the outside in. And from the Philippines, we've seen the example of, you know, the Green parties making a movement, actually trying to effect change from the outside. And you, Serina, you talked about how the political structure in Malaysia actually discourages people from attempting change, and that, you know, people go from the outside also rather than from the inside out. So really, is it more effective for major parties is it more effective for the concerned environmentalists or the public to convince major parties to adopt green stances than to have green parties from the outside with, you know, limited influence, having to fight for funding and resources and so on? What's your view on that? Anyone? Michael?
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with the experience of the Philippines, the environmental groups have already actually started the strategy of working with allies within. As it is, there is really no major group. So the different, like in Malaysia, the groups are of diverse types. So their goals, well, they're only united by the goal of being green, to put it simply. They identify to be environmental, but in terms of specific actions, they do build coalitions and try to connect with legislators, with individual legislators. You see, in the Philippines, our party system is very weak, so it's really very personality based. So they have to connect with someone they know. For example, maybe they've worked with a lawyer turned senator or something like that, or just simply use the connection. And that's how it is. When I say that ENGOs try to make themselves well, be felt, or their influence be felt in the environmental policy process, they do it in different ways. And it is really influence that's very indirect. So they become successful when they get like somebody who serves as their champion in the legislature. In implementation, they're on their own. So it's also connecting with the local government units. So it's very difficult to generalize, but that's how it is. Finally, and the green agenda is only adopted by the different candidates. Like during elections, the campaigns always use the term sustainable development, and there's always a point about something. But in terms of people's interest in this, whether this would be like the crucial points that will make them decide to vote for, let's just say the president. What is more prominent for the voter would be the issues that would affect him or her. So like right now, it's really the pandemic, or in areas, because in our country, in the Philippines, we're always hit by typhoons. So there are many communities just recently affected by a strong typhoon. So issues that would include, that would address food insecurity, livelihood, and so on, connected with environmental issues. So it's a very complicated thing, as what was already expressed earlier by Dr. Serina. So I think that those are the points that I'd like to contribute at this point.
Serina?
Yeah, I think you've got to do a bit of both. I really don't like using people, even if they are politicians, to further an environmental cause, right? Even though for the most part, politicians are really happy to use other people to further their own cause. But sorry, I cannot resist. But you know, it's sometimes you just have to suck it up and do what's needed to get your issues forward, but you have to maintain some kind of distance. There are some causes that completely, I've seen across all the many election campaigns we've had, whether it was federal or state, there's some causes that try and plaster themselves onto a certain party and stick to that. And then they suffer when that party loses, right? And then they lose, you know, whatever opposition party that wins, then will not want to have anything to do with their cause or their issue. What we really need to do is what the Green Party was trying to do, is to maintain this environmental consciousness across everybody. So it doesn't matter what party you are. This should be a bipartisan thing. This should be something that everybody is interested in, right? Because like, if you don't take care of the environment, then what are you gonna live on? You live on a planet, you don't live, you know, I don't understand this lack of awareness, to be honest. But you see, politics works where the money and the power is. So if you can demonstrate that there are people who will vote you into power because of a certain issue in an urban area, for example, that will work. If in a rural area, your politicians who are more interested in money, I think if you can show the politician that there is a financial, political, whatever benefit to them supporting a cause, that might work. But this takes up a lot of energy when it comes to people who are already fighting to empower communities, fighting to prevent destruction to habitats, fighting to work with all kinds of other politics on the ground amongst the communities, amongst developers, amongst whatever, to have that additional layer to liaise and deal with and engage with politicians. That's asking for a lot from environmental groups. Without them then being sucked into politics, right? Where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? So yes, we need environmental parties to put forward issues, but ideally we want all parties to be interested in the environment. How do we get there? I have no idea. We can try, power, politics, money, you know, make it attractive in the ways that they understand. That's why environmental groups try to go and influence policy and start to talk to people, to decision makers in ways that they understand, which is usually finances, power, etc. So we, you know, environmental groups have to change the way they communicate, to be less technical, to relate to issues that these guys in power are interested in. So I think it's a lot of being a chameleon if you're doing that. And I think the need for a single environmental party is really less relevant or less important than trying to get all politicians interested in the issues for the greater benefit of the country as a whole, for everybody in it, because everybody's going to be affected by climate change and natural disasters and floods and all of these things. And we need to understand that. But I am not sure whether we can reach that when so many of the people are still struggling to survive. And the key to voting and winning votes is the economy, and opening for Malaysia, for Johor, for example, opening borders, you know, getting rid of this crazy virus and bringing things back to normal. So I don't know if we can get there maybe in the next 10 years when we are having, you know, more floods and more disasters, then maybe people will sit up, but it's going to take such severe impacts to push us that way. And that's troubling.
Oh, I see Michael's turned on his mic. Did you want to add something?
Look, just to follow up from those, I think, first of all, remember Margaret Mead's old adage, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world because it's the only thing that ever has. And so the advocacy needs to take on a number of different angles, and it can't be done by one group or one small subset. If you think about it, what we're dealing with here is also not just a direct political question, who holds seats in Parliament or what laws are passed or how laws are enforced. It's also a whole series of conceptual ways about how society deals with environmental and sustainability issues. So you need a broad front. You need to spend time looking at the commentariat and the education system. How is that changing the views and attitudes of decision makers, of forthcoming generations? You need traditional NGOs because they are the repositories of information and concern about particular angles. We also need to think about how we upskill some of those, but it will only be a small group, as Serina and Ruth both pointed out, that ever want to make the move into formal electoral politics. At the moment, very few NGOs actually understand, in a genuinely sophisticated sense, and this is a common one right around the world, how politics works, where are the points of influence. It's capacity building, but it's political capacity building. Not only how do legislatures work, how do electoral systems work, but also where are the pressure points for making decisions. In some political parties, it's money. In some political parties, it's the broad-based membership. In others, it's key power makers within that institution. So there are many, many different fronts. And in fact, you want a variety of different organisations. Last comment, Serina's right that there's a lot of people and you can't ask them to, there's a lot of issues. You can't ask a small group of people to do this all. But if everyone does a small piece, then that's how you build a cumulative change. Successful environmental movements and countries with a high environmental consciousness aren't countries that are where all of that is vested in one or two people. There is a multitude of many different voices, but they're all essentially working to the same goal.
Thanks. We've got to move on to the questions now because there's a number that's come in. I have Jeffrey Bakdul from the USA, and he's got two questions. I'm not entirely sure. I think the second question will go to Serina because you mentioned about environmental crimes. But the first question, who was the person who founded the ideology of the Green Party in the 1970s? Maybe that's for you, Michael. And the second one is, do you think that making ecocide an international law can help in the fight against climate change? That might be for Serina.
Yeah, two quick comments. The first one about each. The first one is there's no specific set of ideologies. This is not like organised labour movements or in the 1910s, 1920s, communist and Marxist movements or libertarian parties where there was an espoused set of doctrine that people adopted. It's basically been an evolutionary thing where that's roughly converged towards similar goals. Jeffrey, I talked about before about social justice, sustainability, but it's not like there was a given set of principles of which people have gone forth as disciples to propagate, but rather started just with that general concern and how do I put this into action in the political system as well. What was the second question there? Sorry.
It's whether you think making ecocide an international law can help in the fight.
I'll draw everyone's attention to a recent decision just in the last day or two from a Dutch court that has held that Shell is responsible for a number of climate change actions and has to actually, shareholder activists and green groups are claiming that as a major legal victory. So there's an emerging body of law, but it is still very, very nascent, and ecocide as such is not. Even the Catholic Church at one point has actually started to come out to say that perhaps this breaches, basic canon teaching in the sense that, God created the earth and to destroy it is actually go against the word of God. So I think it is an emerging view in a variety of different perspectives. Over to Serena.
Yeah, interesting point that Michael brought up about Catholic Church. I think WWF, for example, has worked extensively with religious entities to try and sort of rejuvenate or instill an environmental consciousness to some extent. But again, in Malaysia, even religion is politicized. So sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. About making ecocide an international law, to be honest, we've got lots of international laws that are out there whether they are ratified is one thing, and then whether they are, brought down to the local level, and there is enforcement, there is awareness, and then we have issues of corruption. So, there might be a crime, but people can still get away with things. I think it's very nice to know something is in law, and then you can fight for it and maybe take 20 years battling it in court. But what kind of effect does it have immediately on the ground, I think is quite limited, is the short answer.
Just want to add also that in view of the current geopolitical situation in the world, this erosion of multilateralism and international law, I personally, I'm a supporter of international law, but not hopeful at all. And there's no enforcement with all these weakened institutions like the UN. We have a question from Toulouse, from Indonesia. Actually, two questions. Which is about, let me just summarize it, whether any local or indigenous wisdom or values in your respective countries, Philippines and Malaysia, that can encourage people to help with pushing the green agenda upwards. And then the second question is whether with the trend towards green economy and environmental projects amongst company CSR, whether you think, what are the chances of partnering up with economic entities to push this agenda, as well as in implementing the policies? Maybe I'd like to invite Ruth first, and then Serina.
On the first question, if there is any indigenous wisdom,
and values that can help people to, push the green agenda from bottom up.
Yeah, I think there is really so much activity going on at the local level with respect to, to issues that directly affect them. So they might not necessarily be about protecting the environment. So we recall earlier that there are really very specific concerns. It's very hard to say that it's indigenous values and that will be the source of that. I think there's much work being done on raising environmental awareness among Filipinos, but compliance to environmental regulations at the community level is really very low. So that is actually a puzzle. While the campaigns are really very strong, there are many people working towards it. Campaigns for environmental education, people talk about it all the time, but in actual implementation, it's really very weak. For Filipinos, and I'm sorry to say, it's so easy for us to say we're pro-environment, like down with this and let's not use plastic and so, but in terms of the, if you look at the impact of the laws, that environmental laws that have been enacted, there is really very little that has been achieved so far. Now, of course, well, I did not directly answer that question about indigenous values because it's really hard to say if it's only indigenous values that will make an impact on the community level. So I guess that's those are my thoughts with regard to the question. The other question was about is it about the big business being influenced by these environmental groups?
Yes, the CSRs.
Yeah, so in their advocacy, yes. Well, there are many groups that try to do that to make the big companies cooperate with them. But in the case of the Philippines, it's really okay. The big environmental issue, for one of the big environmental issues, for example, is mining, which also cuts to issues of climate change. Because when the different areas are, let's say, a forested area, and there's a big typhoon that hit that area, and there are no more trees there, then it becomes a really a disastrous situation. So it's really the government that is expected to come up with a solution for that. So where do private sector, not just big companies, but the private sector play a role? Well, usually it is in the delivery of the services to those areas that are badly hit by calamities, by natural calamities. So so I think I'll stop at that point and maybe just contribute later if there are any more points that I wish to make.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so indigenous knowledge, yes, of course, there's lots, but I think we, again, as I mentioned just now, we can't stereotype all indigenous or rural or local communities as being, you know, in love with the environment and wanting to protect it. Some people, as I mentioned earlier, really don't care. Some people will support the jobs that are created by destructive entities, like Dr. Ruth said, mining or, you know, oil and gas or development, because it gives them income, because it feeds the family. So they're not going to want to give that up. And then we also need to understand that while there is indigenous practices, knowledge, etc., that can be used to protect the environment, there is also condescension when it comes to indigenous knowledge. And you have scientists who come in and I face this all the time, who feel that indigenous knowledge is not on par with scientific knowledge, for example, or they use the knowledge and then they don't recognize it, and they just disregard it, you know. So whether indigenous knowledge can be used, I think there is some adaptation of it when we talk about nature-based solutions, but again, this is limited. And I think also when it comes to poorer communities, they might want to protect the environment, but they might not have the means. So they might buy, it's just a daily, everyday choice kind of thing, right? So if you can't afford to buy things in bulk or things of quality, you will buy cheaper plastic products that do not last. And then what do they do with the plastic? You know, they keep consuming because they can't afford to buy more expensive, hardier items. They can't afford to buy things in bulk, so they buy little packets because it's all they can afford to buy. And I see this is a problem in the Philippines a lot, where you buy things in small amounts, which then means you have a lot of packaging to deal with. You have also the spillover effect of knowing that, you know, in the past, everything that we used was made out of natural products and we could just toss it, right, into the streams or the rivers or the sea. And now everything's made of plastic and lasts forever. So there's a lot of mindset changing that needs to be done. There's a lot of awareness. There's more, we need to understand the economics of these communities and what they are facing. There is also a condescension towards their knowledge, which then prevents that from being used. When it comes to CSR, yes, it is ideally would be great if environmental groups can work with big companies to protect the environment, and many try to. But, you know, sometimes these companies, in order to have the best photo op, to make the most of the economic investment in a CSR project, they really want to do something quick, glamorous, that you can hold up a banner and take a photo, put it in the press. But the harder, more effective things are long-term. They require a lot of money. They require investment into something which is intangible, which cannot be seen, you can't take a photo and show it on social media. And many large companies are actually reluctant to do what really is needed. So you will have initiatives that say, oh, we put out water coolers all over our office, so then we save on such and such plastic bottles, right? Or we've put, or this is a classic one, we are very sustainable green development, so we have put recycled material into our parking lot bumper stoppers. But you don't take into account how much habitat you've destroyed in building that development, right? So the economics of development, the economics of business do not take into account environmental issues, do not take into account environmental costing, do not take into account ecosystem services, which are lost. And those are really high value. And of course, if you do take it into account, then you lose a lot of money. And that's not good for shareholders. So, you know, it's really complicated. We can't just think that, you know, greenies who stand up and hold banners next to mangroves should go into politics and change it from within. It's not that easy. It's really, really complicated.
And on the other side of the fence as well, the fear of being made use of to, you know, greenwash some of these credentials for the companies. There are tons of questions that's come in, and we're going to be, you know, we're actually over time by 4 minutes. I just want to address a question by a colleague, Melinda Martinez, who's asking about the civil society movement in Malaysia and the Philippines. Do the big companies attempt to subvert the missions of the civil society, or generally try to find middle ground? Do you have an opinion on that? And whether the other question related to this is about Southeast Asian trade unions that are potential powerful actor in the political movement. Do you see them being interested to join the climate coalition? Ruth or Serina? Or maybe Michael?
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll try I'll try that to respond to that question on civil society and business clashing. So, well, I always talk about mining because it's such a big issue in the Philippines, because the government uses, of course, that as the fact that there are so many that the country is mineral resources rich, no? So that can propel economic growth, especially, well, recently the ban on large scale open pit mining has been suspended. So well, the thing about the mining issue in the Philippines is that there is a large lobby for mining, and that is opposed by, of course, by the various environmental groups. So what I showed earlier, the Alliance to Stop Mining, that's a strong anti-mining coalition, and of course, the lobbyists for the mining industry is also strong. So that's one, and there are also in other areas, like in clean air, for against pollution, because of the production of plastics. So there's also that big issue here. While there are many initiatives to already stop the use of plastics, but Serina put it very correctly. It is a huge issue here, the use of plastic packaging, small, which we call sachets, and that amounts to a huge amount of really waste that go to landfills. So that's another one. And there's also the display of business versus environmental groups advocacies there. So I think those are the 2 points that I just want to contribute to respond to that question.
Okay, so maybe Serina, you can address the question about trade unions.
Well, I don't know anything about trade unions, but what I was going to say actually is, to be fair, some companies, big companies or otherwise, really want to do something good. Developers, they want to do something good, but they don't know what to do. So it's whether they're speaking to the right people to do something effective or not. Some staff just want a quick KPI achievement and tick box, but if you engage with them long enough, they will start to turn and find a middle way. So there are companies that if you give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes and you work on them for a long time, they do come around and try to adjust whatever they can within the limitations that they also face, to try and create a win-win situation for everybody, whether it's the environment, the local community, or their business, the shareholders, etc. But a lot of things happen because we enter into engagement antagonistically, with all of these assumptions about each other. So I think people need to think beyond protesting, and start engaging, so that there is communication, there is sharing of views, and then we'll actually find out that all of us are actually on the same page. We're just talking about it in different ways and using a different language. We're all actually trying to get to we're actually on the same river, right? So different rivers heading to the same source. So I think what is needed is more engagement, open engagement, with less assumptions, and trying to find a way to make it work for everyone, without antagonism. There was a point that I forgot. I think there are many companies that have actually tweaked what they want to do to help the community and environment, because they see that there is a positive impact either on their income or just, out of guilt. It does happen. It can happen. I'm not so sure about politicians, but I think companies sometimes can, because of the public pressure on their bottom line.
Or shareholder pressures.
Yes. I don't know anything about trade union.
Seek your indulgence. There are 2 more questions that I feel we should answer if our speakers are not in a rush. Just an indulgence for 5 more minutes to take 2 questions. Okay, the first one is by Hoan, our colleague as well. The effects of climate breakdown and environmental disasters are felt locally, but local administrations can never adequately address this complex and borderless problems. But can green political party formation start at the local level and then scale up to the national level? Do you see any precedents in the region? So just anybody, you don't have to feel obliged to take this if you don't want to. And then the second question is close to my heart. Where do you see opportunities for regional and international cooperation to tackle climate change in the region? What can the role of ASEAN be in tackling climate change in the region? So just these 2 questions, if you can.
Aaron, I'll start the first one. Most organised political green movements have actually around the world have actually begun at a local level. So being organised or a group of like-minded individuals, for example, running for like local town councils, city councils, municipal offices, the most direct level of government usually, or similar sort of offices, is often been the principal organising point. And indeed, in some countries, it's often said that green parties actually tend to be the best organised at the local level of all of the establishment political parties, because of that. That's where they come from, and they feed their candidates through from local government, then ultimately over time as they become more comfortable with it, become standing for state and national or regional positions as well. So it's actually a very common pattern. I can't talk about specific examples that come to mind here, but I did make the point earlier on that in Taiwan, there are still the Green Party is most active and most visible at municipal level these days rather than national.
So no precedents, specific precedents in the region?
Not that I can, not that spring easily to mind. There's probably going to be them. Just drift through. There's a lot more local governments, of course, than there are any other level. So it's easy to concentrate on the state and the national bodies because you can find them and track them really easily. And it also depends on how much power local governments have. And that varies tremendously from one country to another too.
Okay, I see Dr. Ruth has turned on her mic.
I'd like to address the second question so that it can be addressed on the prospects for ASEAN cooperation. Well, on one level, there's institutional framework for it, but then again, the actual impact of regional cooperation has not been, for environmental protection, for climate change, has not really been felt yet. Okay, but I can see that there's an opportunity there, given that, well, you know, in ASEAN, people agree, right? It might take some time, but they will say yes. but in my view, that can already be taken as a positive sign that if there was agreement on certain points, then the ASEAN government, the governments of ASEAN member states can probably be pushed. Although, of course, we know that in ASEAN, the ASEAN way is really just waiting for everybody to say, yeah, okay. So there's consensus.
Oh, nobody
will
say no.
Yes, nobody will say no. But I guess like what I've already said, I think more than twice earlier, that it's so easy to make the laws, the regulations, or the rules, but the difficulty is really in making it work at the local level, especially. So, well, in the interest of time, I'll just stop there. But I think the ASEAN cooperation thing is an idea for another webinar. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing your insights. So we look forward to connecting with everyone again, and in the meantime, please take care and have a pleasant day ahead. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.